and I think that's what you were almost admitting today, and given all the pain that has resulted to this country, don't you owe us an apology?
I think what we owe the British public is a system of regulating our banks and our financial sector that will never allow the same problems and mistakes to arise again, and that's exactly what we're doing together with the Financial Services Authority. Well, I'll tell you why. Because the financial services markets, the banking industry, was changing so much more quickly and in so many more different ways than anyone realised on either side of the Atlantic at the time. Yes, it's easy to say with hindsight that we should have seen all this coming, but nobody did. These changes were happening so quickly. The lack of transparency in the banks, both here and in the United States, was so serious that none of the regulators did their job properly at any part of the world. Now, what we need now is a proper system of internationally joined up regulation, not having different jurisdictions competing against each other, London versus New York, so that the banks can play us off against each other. We've got to have an international regulatory system, and that's what we're putting in place through negotiation.
But Peter Mandelson, an unsustainable rise in house prices, the rise in personal debts to absolutely record levels, and indeed the way that banks were financing themselves, that was visible.
Yes.
I mean, and you were in power when this was going on. I mean, the question really, I suppose, that most people will be asking is, was the government asleep at the wheel, careless or reckless?
No, I think I've answered that. Look, the main problem was the sorts of derivative financial products that were being created and marketed by these banks, cutting and slicing and dicing different things put together so that nobody knew what they were, how much they were worth, and what the consequences would be if they went wrong. Now, regulation has got to make sure that that does not happen again, and that's what we're going to make sure.
Can I just say surely that's the absolutely key point, that at the heart of any financial services system must be the assessment of risk. And what Peter's just said, I think, confirms the fact that there was an absence of risk management in all of these activities, and that is a product of the lack of governance structures in place in the industry and the failure of regulation. I think that rests very clearly at the responsibility of the UK government.
Right. We do need to have an international regulatory system so the banks can't play themselves off against each other. But a critical point, if you look at naked swaps, for example, that's roughly the equivalent of putting money on a horse race. It has absolutely no economic benefit, and you've only got to look at what's happening with Goldman Sachs at the moment to see the kind of impact that that actually had. Now, it seems to me that all of us were worried about it. None of us could put our finger on it. But what we have to secure for the future is actually a banking system that serves commerce and industry, and that means divorcing the casino from the utility.
Well, we'll come on to that in a minute. But Peter Mandelson, Ken Clark, has been calling for more international regulation of the banks so that whether they're in Frankfurt or London or New York, there's a basic common set of rules. But your party has proposed a unilateral tax on British bankers based here. Now, these are people that could go anywhere. I mean, this is political posturing, isn't it?
Peter was talking about regulation. We need international standards of regulation, but national regulators. You've got to give a national regulator in the City of London. I think the government was slow starting to negotiate that. The market's still moving rapidly. You need a proper regulator. Our regulator's got to be the Bank of England, the central government.
What about the
bank
tax?
has the authority to do it. A tax, I think the recent IMF proposals are very interesting. We must have a tax on banks, partly to recover money for the taxpayer, partly to make sure that the risks they take are discouraged as far as possible by the tax system. I think there will be international agreement. I think my party, in saying we were going to go ahead, helped join what was a rapidly forming international consensus. The Swedes, the Germans, the others, like the British Conservatives, were saying taxing banks is actually something we're entitled to do to recover the cost. It also could be a very useful tool to make sure that you have some effect on the risks they take in future.
Ken Clark, I mean, the International Monetary Fund are proposing two types of tax. One of them would be a tax on banks' profits and remuneration, tax on bonuses. Would you be in favour of that?
Well, I mean, that's more a revenue-raising tax, in my opinion, and I think most members of the public would say that actually getting some revenue out of the banks is not a bad thing when you look at the risks that face other people. I would look at that. I wait to see for a start what emerges from the international consensus. So that is one where if we had a tax on profits and bonuses, but other countries didn't join in, then as you said a moment ago,
Could I just point out
let me ask John Thurston. I want your reaction. All right.
I just want to point out that Ken has quite rightly placed the emphasis on international agreement, international levies, international regulation. That's contrary to what David Cameron called for the other week, which was for a national tax and levy.
No, it's
He's
not.
completely at odds with his own leader.
He said we were one of the ones that would go ahead. Others have joined in. There is an international consensus.
Good try, Ken.
Good try. Very cunning, Peter, but on the substance, I think your party's been rather left behind. I think the point, John,
all right.
is rather peripheral.
John Thurston, let me bring you in. You've mentioned already that your party proposes to break up the big banks into much smaller banks and to separate their functions between the utility banks and what you call the casino banks. Why are you being so cavalier with a sector in which Britain is still a world leader?
It's a sector that nearly brought us to our knees, and it could do it again. There's a very straightforward proposition, which is that you have one function in the utility banks, which is about dealing with commerce and industry taking deposits, and they have an explicit now guarantee from the state. That cannot be used to fund much riskier investment and merchant banking, or even the riskier still instruments. It is absolutely fair to take those two apart so they can both flourish with different cultures in different ways.
Peter Mandelson, what's your reaction to that?
Banks need to